Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is a brief obituary of Sir Eric Anderson, who was called to his reward yesterday. By a bizarre coincidence, for the first time ever, I cycled to Eton, and above upper school I thought, hey, why is that flag there? It's not even the school flag, it's the Royal Standard, and it's at half-mast. Who's died? A member of the royal family. Later that day I found out that Sir Eric Anderson had died. So Sir Eric was headmaster of Eton 1980 to 1994, and then he came back in 2000 and served as provost for 9 years. Provost is the head of the board of governors, but he lives in the provost's lodging, so he's the ultimate authority at Eton. So between those two positions, he was at Eton for 23 years. And I don't think anyone in the 20th century, so far in the 21st century, has been in charge of Eton in either capacity for anything like that. And it's a very long time since someone's been head man and provost. If you're not an Etonian watching this, you wouldn't realise headmaster at Eton is commonly called the head man. Incidentally, Eton is almost unique in spelling headmaster as two separate words. It's a compound word in everywhere else. All right, so Sir Eric, he was born in North Britain in 1936. His family were kilt makers, and he went to one of the better schools in Edinburgh. Forgive me, I can't remember which one it was. Was it George Watson's College? And then he went on to the University of St Andrews, which is also in Scotland. So he was Scots, but he didn't bang on about it that much. And then he read English at St Andrews, which is one of Scotland's top universities. Well, Edinburgh's probably the best, but St Andrews a close second. It's a very small town on the coast, about half a dozen golf courses, very historic place. Was once the religious capital of Scotland, and St Andrews is supposedly buried there by St Regulus. Incidentally, he was brought up in the Church of Scotland. So then he went to Oxford University to do a DPhil, that's a doctorate. I don't think he had to do a substantive master's degree because the older Scots universities, Edinburgh, St Andrews, Glasgow and Aberdeen, award an MA as a primary degree. You do that for 4 years because typically people finish school at 17 doing Highers. That's a school leaving exam in Scotland. And so then he came down to Oxford. And which Oxford college was he to go to? He went to Balliol, and that's a college with very strong Caledonian connections because it's named after John Balliol, a Scots nobleman who owned extensive estates in England as well. So it was founded in the 13th century. Forgive me, I think it's 1264. There's a debate between Balliol, Merton, and Univ in Oxford as to which is the most ancient college. So they all lay some sort of claim to it. And the John Balliol who founded that college, his grandson became King of Scots, the Tomb Tabard, as he's known. Anyhow, so he wrote a DPhil thesis on the novels of Sir Walter Scott, who of course came from Anderson's hometown. He was W.E.K. Anderson, but known by his middle name Eric. The K stood for Kinloch. I can't for the life of me recall what the W stood for. So anyway, he completed that, and he was said to be a romantic right-winger. I know about it from the other side of the desk because years later I was the housemate of an Eton beak called Anthony James. A teacher at Eton is called a beak, but I mean we just quite often use the ordinary word teacher. And Anthony James, he taught there at Eton for only a year, and it was right before I came up. As I say, I subsequently shared a house with him, so he told me a lot about Eric. And when Anthony applied for this job at Eton, I don't want to go too much into Anthony James. He got a phone call from him. That was how desperate they were to fill the economics position. Anyway, so Anthony walks in for the interview, and Sir Eric, who wasn't knighted at the time, Dr. Anderson greeted him with it, Floreat Domilos de Balliolo, as in may the little house of Balliol flourish, as in that's the Oriel College toast. Balliol College toast. And Anthony said, in that moment, I knew I got the job, easiest job interview of his life. So giving Anthony the job for 1 year with the possibility to extend it if it went really well. But in fact, Dr. Anderson wasn't being honest because he already knew he had someone lined up for the subsequent year. And if Balliol was really a big thing in his life, why couldn't he have been frank with Anthony that he had no intention of giving Anthony a job for longer than a 12-month? Anyhow, so his enthusiasm with Sir Walter Scott was satisfied. Time to choose a career, and he immediately went into teaching. Taught at various independent schools. I have a feeling Gordon's was his first, where he taught the current Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, the future monarch. And where did he go next? Was he at Abingdon? Was he headmaster? I think he'd been a headmaster of a couple of places. So then he was married to Poppy, an English woman. Her name was actually Elizabeth, went by Poppy. And they had a daughter and a son. And his son went to Eton in the 70s. So his son left Eton just before Dr. Anderson took over as head man. His son became a barrister, a QC, is now a peer of the realm. I can't remember which title he has. But anyway, so Dr. Anderson took over Eton in 1980, and obviously it was the foremost school in the Commonwealth, had this amazing history behind it. Of course, he'd never taught there before, seen as a bit of an outsider. He's the only ever Eton headmaster not to be an undergraduate at either Oxford or Cambridge. So some people felt that he didn't quite belong, but perhaps he proved them wrong. Now, I heard this tale, probably apocryphal, that required an act of Parliament to allow him to become head man, because Eton, obviously, it was a Catholic institution in the 15th century, subsequently became an Anglican one at the Reformation, and of course you had to be a communicant of the established church in order to be head man. But I don't know if they actually had to change the law over this, because he was a Presbyterian, but he would worship in the Church of England too. I don't think he was particularly religious. He'd be taught at Fettes in the 70s as well, which is one of Edinburgh's grandest schools, where in his house was an irksome little twerp named Tony Blair, who was a bit argumentative, but Dr. Anderson admitted that Tony always had a point when he was arguing that there was some injustice. So when Dr. Anderson was at Fettes, the head man, briefly, was Anthony Shenwick Trench, formerly the headmaster of Eton. Shenwick Trench had been head man of Eton for about 5 years in the 60s. Given the old heave-ho, chummy as it was called, he was very diminutive, often mistaken for a butler, and he'd been a prisoner of the Japanese building the Burma Railway and gone absolutely doolally. So Shenwick Trench, seen so many of his friends died from malnutrition, overwork, the lack of any medical care, savage beatings, had attempted to keep himself sane by composing A Shropshire Lad by A.E. Houseman into Latin rhyming couplets. He'd succeeded in producing a marvellous translation, but not succeeded in maintaining his sanity. Nevertheless, he became head man of Eton, was an absolute flagellomaniac, and also a bit squiffy, so had to be pushed out, was out of a job for a year, took over Fettes, and then died en poste, just about the time that Dr. Anderson went to take over Eton. And so he brought in some reforms. He decided there'd be a full-time Catholic chaplain, and there was one, about 10% of the boys being Roman Catholics. So Father Knott, a Jesuit, took over. And what else? I mean, the buildings weren't in a great state. He built a new gym and so on. But it was a different era. And even at Eton, the facilities weren't thought to be world-class. The fees were nothing like as high as they are now in real terms, a third of what they are now. So it was the era of Thatcherism. But he wasn't associated with the Conservative Party or any political party. There was all the suspicion that Tonys were Tories. There was a lot of far-left activism, some people saying that independent schools should be abolished. The Labour 1983 manifesto, saying that they ought to be outlawed, a bit like Labour's manifesto in 2019, harked back to that. So he did an awful lot for rowing and for theatre, one of his enthusiasms. He made a point of teaching every single F block division. And mine was F7. He was meant to teach us and he didn't bloody show up. And there was this thing where you could get a run on him, as in if you could go to, school office before he could touch one of you, you'd get him into trouble. The beak, he'd have to apologise to the head man. Who could the head man apologise to? Only to the provost. But anyway, so he never actually taught us. I never spoke to him. He judged me in an F block declamation competition, which I really fluffed because I had performance anxiety. Because I was chosen by my F div to represent them, and I was stunned when people who wanted to represent the division, that's the class, read it out in front of the 25 boys. I did my bit, and the teacher, Mrs. Rees, let the boys choose who they thought should represent F7, and they chose me, and I was stunned because I was unpopular. They weren't picking me because they liked me, but because they recognised I was the best. So that was very touching. Pity that I screwed it up later. So he did a lot for rowing, and rowing is an expensive sport. And I recall that my first summer he retired, and an announcement was made in house prayers as in this evening assembly in each house. So all rowers were to go to the river and get into a boat, a single scull, a 4, an 8, or whatever, an octuple, and to wait around the corner at Lower Hope, because Dr. Anderson and Mrs. Anderson were going somewhere or other. They were giving a boat, and they're going to row a jolly boat as a present, a leaving present. They're going to row back to Rafts, the main Eton boathouse, and go around the corner and see hundreds and hundreds of boats, every boat Eton had, from the other boathouses, from Andrews and from Masters, as a surprise, and it was all word of mouth, no notice put out, just in case he saw, this being the days before the internet. So he's given a pleasant surprise. And then hundreds of boats tried to come in after him into rafts, and there was the most massive traffic jam on the Thames. And for the first time ever, I saw one of the boats capsize in the Thames. It was a 4, and the boys who were thrown into the drink, they were giggling about it. I thought the press would publish something about it, but they never ever did. So that was Dr. Anderson. He had presence, although he seemed oddly gauche when he was addressing groups, like moving his head quite up and down like that. Something distant, something almost shy about him. Very genuine. I don't think I heard of anyone ever criticise him, actually. So it was a measure of his success that he lasted 14 years. His successor lasted 8 years. That was Mr. Elliot. And then Tony Little came in about, oh God, let me think about this, 2002. And how long did he last? Fairly long, almost 14 years as well. And not many headmasters have lasted as long as 14 years. That was that. He stood down as head man. He tried to broaden the basis of the school. And bring in people who weren't so wealthy, starting these junior scholarships aiming at boys aged 11 or at state schools. So he told himself that it was as a public benefit. I remember Anthony James scorning that, saying, yeah, the King's Scholarship is aimed that you can only pass it if you've been to one of about 6 prep schools, the top prep schools, because they're still all middle class. I mean, it almost never goes to someone who's genuinely working class. They're about middle class people who'd struggle to afford the fees, and this would help them. They wouldn't quite otherwise make it. Some that could afford the fees anyway. So they mostly been to like Ludgrove, Summerfields, the Dragon School, I can't remember, Elstree, one of the other, Westminster Under School, Collet Court, one of the top prep schools. So he was quite authoritative. He had a bass voice, had a vestige of a North British accent. And that was approachable, likable, respected, reluctant to expel people. He'd had to deal with the first big outburst of drug abuse, I suppose. Well, there probably was a bit of it in the 60s, a bit more. But the radicalism wasn't so much in the air. They weren't talking like in the 60s they were about abolishing school dress. So I don't think he got anything particularly wrong. It was much easier time to be a head man because the states largely butted out. There wasn't so much regulation. There wasn't all this child protection worry. And the results were pretty good. People weren't too fussed about that. They weren't screwing around with the exam system all the time. So you kind of had the last of the easy years to be a head man. Parents weren't demanding this or that. Eton and the top schools are not that responsive to parents. You don't like it, bugger off. Go to another school. We're Eton. We don't care. We could easily replace you. It's the schools which are less prestigious, which struggle to fill the role. They're responsive to parental complaints. We're second best, so we try harder because they're desperate to get enough pupils, which is why they'll give you what you want if you complain and want an exception. So then he went on to be rector of Lincoln. By the way, you can see this documentary, Eton Class of 91, as in filmed in 1991. So it's just after the 450th anniversary of the school. And there are interviews with him there saying, I won't pretend for one moment that most boys are religious. So Dr. Anderson notably had no teacher training whatsoever, as was typical for that era. Those were the days. Presumably he did national service because, when he was at youth in the 50s, all boys had to do 2 years in the armed forces. So, you had a degree and that was it. You could teach in independent schools straight away. Independent schools were genuinely independent. As long as you didn't kill people or something, the teachers could do what they want. It's nothing to do with the government. Bugger off. You don't pay for it. Not taking taxpayers' money, but out. And even state schools are much less regulated. But you wouldn't get away with that now. There he is, exalted as a magnificent pedagogue, and he was pretty good, but he had no PGCE or any teacher training of any kind, and you just wouldn't be able to do that anymore. So how was it Eton could be so marvellous when it had someone like him in charge? Because we weren't over-regulated. It was a much, much better era. But of course, according to today's regulation mania, he was absolutely useless. He should never be able to teach a single lesson because he hadn't done a PGC, because he hadn't filmed out these stacks and stacks of lesson plans, because he hadn't gone to a real roughhouse school to be verbally abused and publicly humiliated. That's called teacher training. It's an emotional assault course for, masochists. Anyway, so he became rector of Lincoln College, Oxford. So Oxford University's got 39 colleges, one of which is Lincoln. No, not named after Abraham Lincoln, named after the Bishop of Lincoln. It's on Turl Street. And I don't think who went there. Anyone famous? Oh, well, the Reverend John Wesley was a fellow there, as in one of the academics there. So he had no particular connection with Lincoln, but he took over that one, did that for 6 years. He wasn't universally popular there amongst the senior common room. Some of the dons said he tried to treat Lincoln like a hotel for his mates and was mentioning Eton a bit too much, some feeling people a bit alienated. Of course, he was going to talk about it. He spent 14 years there. It was a very prestigious job. So after a relatively short spell, 6 years, he went back to Eton and he was invested as provost. And he stayed there for a further 9 years. His daughter actually got married in Eton College Chapel. Anyway, so he was fairly caring. He didn't expel people too much. He's the one who got rid of caning. So all-round stand-up chap. I can't think if anyone had a harsh word to say about him at Eton, which is odd. The boys used to call him Eric. He bore a striking resemblance to Dick Haddon, one of the modern languages speaks. He had a slightly red nose. I don't think he was an alcoholic. So that was Dr. Anderson, fairly good guy. I mean, it wasn't that much of a difficult time to be in charge. Well, what can I say? All credit to him. I'm not sure what he died of. I don't think it was coronavirus. He died at the age of 84. I mean, I think his wife, Poppy, survives him. So, yeah, he was knighted a few years ago. He's the headmaster of Boris Johnson and David Cameron. Don't hold that against him. Retired in 2009 as Provost of Eton. I don't know what he did the remaining years of his life. So that is Sir Eric Anderson. May he rest in peace. I happened to go back to Eton the other day. Of all the days I chose to cycle, and that's the day he dies. I'm a jinx. I better not go back tomorrow. Toodaloo.